The night was surprisingly quiet, and the air in the house seemed muffled in anticipation of something unknown. I walked down the hallway, savoring the peace that enveloped me when everything around me fell asleep. The whole day had been busy, full of worries and things to do, but now was the moment of rest. I was anxious to get to my room and rest when suddenly I felt a strange pulling tension, as if something was wrong. The feeling came out of nowhere, but I chalked it up to fatigue. As I passed the bedroom, I glanced almost involuntarily at the door, which was ajar. Nothing out of the ordinary. My husband was probably asleep and my son was probably resting after a hard day's work. I didn't know exactly what was behind the door, but at that moment something made me stop. Taking a breath, I took a step toward the room. My hand reached for the knob, and I opened the door with difficulty. I didn't know why, but I decided not to knock because it was our house, and nothing seemed to suggest trouble. As soon as the door creaked open, I saw them, my husband and son. But everything was not as it should have been. At first, my brain couldn't accept what was happening before my eyes. The husband and son were in the room. But what were they doing? How were they sitting so close to each other? It was something more than just their normal conversations. The atmosphere in the room was saturated with something strange, something I couldn't immediately understand. The seconds dragged on like an eternity. My heart stopped for a moment, and the world around me seemed to disappear. Was I wrong? Had I misunderstood something? Their gazes crossed, and I felt everything inside me freeze. But it wasn't just a misunderstanding. I saw them pull away in embarrassment, as if they'd been caught. Something in their eyes, in their posture, told me that something more than a mere coincidence had happened. My husband and son were silent, and I stood there, unable to move, realizing that I had unwittingly witnessed something I didn't want to see. My head filled with unanswered questions. Why were they reacting this way? How could this have happened? It was too difficult to perceive. I felt as if the walls of the room began to shrink, and I was short of air. But what was really happening? What was behind the bewilderment and silence? Was what I was seeing really happening? And if so, how could I deal with this discovery? I couldn't understand what was really going on behind the closed doors. One thing was certain. It couldn't have been an accident. I stood in the doorway, unable to look away. My eyes couldn't believe what they were seeing. Everything that was happening seemed unreal, like some distant, vague dream that you can't touch, but that refuses to leave your reality. My consciousness refused to accept this picture. My husband and son were sitting side by side on a bed. Their bodies weren't just in the same proximity, they were too close. There was something subtly odd about their postures. The husband leaned slightly, his hand seeming to rest almost involuntarily on his son's thigh. There wasn't the usual nonchalance of a father in that gesture. It was something else, elusive and dangerous. There was an undercurrent of anxiety in their gazes, as if they both knew none of this was meant to be. But that was what made me feel like I was witnessing something far more important and forbidden. My heart hammered more frequently. I couldn't understand what was happening, and yet I could feel every moment, every movement seeming to freeze in the air, imbuing the room with an unknown tension. And then, as I stood in this confusion, I saw their gazes cross. No words, just silent recognition. I took a couple of steps back, but my hand still clung to the doorknob, not letting go. I had a feeling that if I didn't stay, if I didn't find out what was going on, this anxiety would never leave me. It seemed their gaze was an invitation for me to stay. What I saw was not to go unnoticed. The husband turned toward his son, his hand shifting a little higher on his back. He didn't say a word, but there was something ambiguous about the movement, something that made me freeze. Their bodies were so close that I could feel the heat between them, as if they shared more than just space. It wasn't just physical proximity. It was a hidden contact, something intimate that went beyond the normal interaction between father and son. I couldn't break out of this circle of doubt. Why were their bodies so close, so unnaturally tightly intertwined? My head filled with questions, and every time I tried to quiet my thoughts, they returned with renewed vigor. Maybe this is just my exaggeration. Maybe I'm wrong, and this is all just a fluke that doesn't matter. My fingers trembled, and I felt the awkwardness overwhelm me. Why couldn't I take my eyes off of what was happening in the room? I couldn't help but notice my husband tilting his head slightly, his lips almost touching my son's ear, and that touch was filled with something that was too personal to be ordinary. The son did not pull away. On the contrary, his gaze was full of acceptance. I froze, unable to move. There was something in their behavior that I couldn't figure out, and it made my heart beat faster. I could feel the air around me growing thicker, as if it was soaking up this hidden energy between them. But what was really behind it? Was it simply a sign of intimacy between father and son? Or was there something much darker, more intolerable behind it? I couldn't afford it, but I wanted to know what would happen next. I could no longer look away. The silence that hung in the air was almost palpable. It was not ordinary. It wasn't just a pause in conversation, not waiting for the next word. It was an emptiness, filled with unspoken feelings, those impossible to hide. I stood in the doorway as if paralyzed, unable to move, unable to say a word. Every second felt like an eternity. My gaze seemed to travel through their bodies, penetrating their thoughts. With each passing moment, the tension increased, and I couldn't help but notice how their breaths became deeper, how their bodies almost merged into each other. Husband and son both stood still, unmoving, as if they didn't know what to make of what was between them. I couldn't understand what was going on. Everything in my head was getting confused. I tried to keep outwardly calm, but a storm was brewing inside me. I searched for an answer, but I couldn't find it. Why couldn't I take my eyes off this scene? Why was I drawn to be here, despite everything I saw? I felt everything inside me constrict as the air in the room grew thicker. My husband pulled away from his son with difficulty and looked at me. But his gaze was not the same as usual. It was a look full of anxiety and, perhaps, even guilt. His eyes, full of silent questioning, told me more than words could express. My son didn't look at me. He was too busy, his attention completely absorbed in what was happening. I noticed him leaning forward slightly, his hand unintentionally touching his father's shoulder. The gesture was so natural, as if they were already used to such a touch, but to me it was as if it was signaling that whatever was going on between them went beyond a simple familial relationship. What's going on? I tried to find answers, but my thoughts were tangled in a strange swirl of emotions and doubts. Why wasn't this scene, this closeness of their bodies, causing rejection like I expected? Why couldn't I just walk away without looking back and forget what I'd seen? My husband turned to his son again, his hand slowly sliding down his back, making me feel the warmth emanating from their bodies. It was so intimate, so tender, that I couldn't understand what was supposed to be happening between them. Was this just a father and son loving embrace, hidden from view? Or Was there something much more lurking here than I could realize? Neither of them spoke a word, and I couldn't find words either. I was just a spectator, caught off guard, not knowing how I should behave in this situation, how I should understand what was going on. My body was like a prisoner of these looks and touches that weren't overt, but still said more than words could. With each passing minute, I could feel my anxiety growing. My legs started to give out. I couldn't figure out what had to be right. I wanted to leave, but everything in my head said I needed to stay and see what would happen next. What was behind that look in my son's eyes, behind that silence between them? Why couldn't they stop? And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, my husband finally opened his mouth, but his words became full of riddles, full of awkwardness, as if he himself wasn't sure what he was going to say. Did you see it?" His voice shook, and I felt the question make my insides clench. My eyes couldn't look away. It was as if they were fixated on this invisible but so obvious tension between them. It was more than just a meeting of eyes. Their eyes met, and in those fleeting moments I saw something more, something hidden, something they were trying to keep to themselves but couldn't quite conceal. I tried to find answers in their expressions, but they remained hidden like a fog. Husband and son exchanged glances, and there was something indefinable in each of them, something that could not be described in words. It seemed that their gazes were exchanging not just thoughts, but whole stories, whole worlds that I could not understand, but intuitively felt. I began to notice details that had seemed insignificant before. Now, however, they took on a special significance. The way my husband stared into his son's eyes, his gaze sometimes lingering on his son's lips and then sliding down his neck. I noticed how his hand would suddenly lay on his son's shoulder, touching his skin with such gentleness as if it were the most natural gesture. It was so intimate, so light, that I felt a chill run down my spine. Why hadn't they noticed it? Why did it seem so natural when I felt like it should have been forbidden? Why weren't they pulling away from each other? The son, for his part, didn't look away, as if he couldn't or wouldn't. He tilted his head slightly, and then his hand moved involuntarily, gently touching his father's arm, her fingers sliding over his palm before returning to his thigh again. The movement was almost invisible, but I noticed it, and it left me breathless. The air in the room felt like it was thick. I could feel the lack of oxygen in it, and everything around me started to lose its normal shape. I tried to look for answers, but the more I watched, the more everything around me became confused. Those looks, those touches, those silent exchanges, it was something completely unspeakable, something that defied logic. It was as if my husband sensed my gaze, but instead of averting his eyes, he moved a little closer to his son. I noticed how his fingers suddenly squeezed his son's shoulder lightly, as if there was something important in that touch, something they both couldn't put into words, and the son didn't pull away. He seemed absorbed, his face soft and his breathing a little more labored. It was all giving away something more. My mind was getting more and more confused. What was going on between them? I was beginning to feel a strange, almost magnetic attraction pulling me into their world, and I couldn't tear myself away from it. My senses were raging. With each new look, I felt myself slowly losing myself, losing my ability to think clearly. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I was trapped by this unknown and forbidden. I noticed my husband glance at me, but his gaze was not ordinary. It was full of not only anxiety, but also urging. It seemed like he was expecting something from me. I don't know why, but in that moment, I felt the tension turn to something more. I began to realize that everything that was happening was no accident. It was part of something far more complex than I could comprehend. My son met my gaze again, and there was something in his eyes that awakened a mixture of emotions in me. His gaze was deep, dark, as if he was trying to tell me something. But what was it? What was he trying to tell me? And why did it seem to me that in that gaze was hidden a part of the mystery I had been so unable to solve? In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just an accident, not just a moment of awkward embarrassment. Everything that was happening between them was part of something far more powerful than I could have imagined. And now, here I was, utterly consumed by it, not knowing how to leave, how to escape what awaited me around every corner of their play of glances. The silence in the room became more and more palpable. Every breath, every movement seemed to echo in the air, making me feel every moment more tense. I stood in the doorway, unable to move, not knowing what to do. My heart was beating too fast, and my mind couldn't gather itself to realize what was happening. The slightest movement and the tension was immediately apparent. Every look, every gesture seemed to say more than words. The husband leaned closer to his son, and his fingers slid down his arm. It was so quiet, so light, that at first I thought it might have been just a casual gesture, but it wasn't. I saw his fingers gently draw a line along my son's forearm, and the touch was far more deliberate than I could have imagined. His hand lingered on my son's skin, as if waiting for some kind of reaction. I could feel this moment seeping into me, as if I was becoming a part of what was happening between them. The son didn't pull away. On the contrary, his body leaned slightly toward his father, as if giving in to this invisible attraction that had developed between them. He did not take his eyes away, and with each passing moment he seemed more and more absorbed in the moment. There seemed to be something forbidden, inexpressible, even in these simple touches. It wasn't just tenderness or father-son intimacy. It was something much more, something that lurked behind their behavior. My heart twitched as I watched my husband slowly, barely perceptibly, slide his palm across his son's back, and he, in turn, made a barely perceptible gesture of leaning closer, as if absorbed in something I couldn't understand. Silently, without words, their bodies were so close I could barely breathe. Their movements were fluid, natural, almost like a dance, but I couldn't escape the feeling that this was a dance with fire. Every step could lead to destruction. I tried to hold myself together, but each moment was more and more dragging. There was more than just intimacy in this room. It was something strange that I couldn't understand, but I intuitively felt it. Something was happening here that should never have happened. My husband seemed to notice my embarrassment, and his gaze fell on me again. He met my eyes, and I saw something strange in them that couldn't have been just consternation. It was something else, something far more meaningful, something that made me feel like an observer in my own life. He didn't say a word, but his eyes said everything. That look was a mixture of confusion and warning. I felt his every look penetrate me, as if he wanted me to understand something important that lay on the line between words and silence. I stood in the doorway, lost in my thoughts. Was I really ready to accept what was happening between them? Was it really as I saw it, or was I wrong? Could it have been just an innocent moment, a simple touch that meant nothing? But then, why did I feel like it was no accident? Why did everything around me seem so forbidden? And why couldn't I, in spite of it all, make myself leave? I glanced again at their hands, which were now barely letting go of each other, as if they were trying to figure out what this invisible bond between them was. Everything around me froze, as if time had disappeared in the room. I realized that I couldn't go back anymore, that something invisible was holding me here, in this moment, in this look, in this touch. With each passing moment, I was losing more and more of my sense of reality. I could no longer separate my intuition from my feelings. Everything seemed vague, blurred, as if I were part of their game, part of what lay behind those silent, forbidden gestures. And now, standing in the doorway, I couldn't help but know the truth, to realize what was really going on. There was such silence in the room that every whisper, every sound was deafening. I couldn't tear myself away from them, and yet I could feel my inner world crumbling under the weight of what I was hearing. Everything was filled with hidden meanings, ineffable words that could mean so much but remained unexplained. I tried to grasp every nuance of their conversation, but the words were wrapped in such subtle cues that I couldn't tell where ordinary conversation ended and something much deeper began. "You realize this isn't just an accident, don't you?" my husband said, his voice low, barely audible, but each word seemed to leave a mark in the air. His eyes never left his son's, and I noticed his hand touching his shoulder again, as if he were looking to him for support, or perhaps affirmation. There wasn't the usual sternness in his voice that would characterize a conversation between father and son. It was something much more personal, more intimate. The son was silent for a while, his gaze fixed on his father, but his face remained hidden from me. It was as if he was trying to unravel something important in his father's words, but he also realized that every word now could be the beginning of something that shouldn't have been said. His breathing was even, but even so, I could feel him tense up. He didn't seem to know what to say. "Of course," he said at last, his voice calm, but there was an undercurrent of tension in it. "I understand. But you can't make me do anything I don't want to do." Those words threw me off balance. I couldn't understand how they could talk about something like that so calmly, almost with ease. There was something in their words that made me feel alien, unable to understand what was happening between them. I tried to analyze what was behind those words, what they were really trying to say, but no answers came. "I'll never force you." My husband leaned closer, his voice even quieter, as if they were both inside some game I wasn't invited to play. "But you should know that some things take determination. There's nothing wrong with that, if that's what you want to do." Those words sounded like they contained a whole unexplored universe, full of hidden meanings that remained beyond my comprehension. I tried to read their faces, but everything was unclear. I didn't know what to think. This conversation, their quiet words full of multiple meanings, gripped me more and more. I felt the air in the room getting denser, as if space was shrinking around me. "Sometimes you don't know what you want until you feel it," my husband continued, his fingers lightly touching my son's neck again, and I noticed his lips tighten slightly, as if holding back something important. Every movement he made was now filled with hidden meaning. Again, I could feel this play on words becoming more and more intense. Everything I saw was meaningful. Everything they said remained on the edge of what I could understand, but didn't dare to realize. Every touch, every word, every look was full of hidden meanings, and I couldn't tell where innocence ended and the dangerous territory of the forbidden began. "You know that I'm always here for you," my husband said, his voice soft but confident. I noticed the way his palm slid slowly down my son's back, and there was something in that gesture that I couldn't explain. It was so personal, so intimate, that I felt an emptiness in my chest. I was on the verge of figuring out what was behind their behavior, but every step in that direction only plunged me into more uncertainty. I wanted to find answers, but the more I tried to understand, the more the mystery eluded me. Everything that was happening was beginning to sound inevitable, as if these words, these touches, were part of what was going to happen. My heart was beating faster than ever. Each beat echoed in my temples, and I felt the air around me constrict, as if it were filled with the unspoken feelings that filled the room. I stood there, unable to take my eyes off them, and with every movement they made, I felt those feelings seep into me as if they were my own. I watched their every gesture, their every look, and it seemed that everything that was happening was not just a scene, but a whole world of emotions, hidden but so strong that I could literally feel their vibrations in the air. The husband and son said almost nothing, but in their movements, in the way they looked at each other, there was everything you needed to know. Their breaths merged. They were so close that I could feel that invisible contact even through space. It wasn't just a physical presence, but something much deeper that touched every cell in my body. My husband lightly touched my son's face, his fingers barely touching the skin, but it was so full of meaning that I couldn't help but notice. My son didn't pull away. On the contrary, his eyes closed for a moment, and he tilted his head slightly, as if he sensed that this touch was something more important than just a gesture. There was a mixture of trust and something else in his gaze, something I couldn't understand, but that was impossible to ignore. My heart clenched again. I could feel the tension building in my chest, as if I was involved in their world, in their feelings, in their silent struggle for something that had no logical explanation. I tried to keep myself from entering that world, but my feelings couldn't help but echo back as if they were part of me. My husband, noticing that I couldn't look away, raised an eyebrow slightly, and I saw something strange in his gaze. It wasn't just alarm, it was something, an invitation, a call that made me stop and feel that they both knew something that I was yet to understand. But it was something hidden, elusive. The son seemed to sense that look too. He shook a little. His eyes met mine again, but there was something in their depths that made me lost in conjecture. He didn't say a word, but his gaze was full of meaning. I could feel his emotions behind that gaze directed not only at his father, but at me as well. I stood as if captive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was part of this game, part of what was happening between them. It wasn't just curiosity, it was deeper than that, and I could feel something beginning to awaken in my soul that I couldn't understand, but that was definitely connected to their feelings. And then, when I couldn't take the silence any longer, when the air was getting thicker and thicker, my husband turned to me again. He didn't say a word, but his eyes spoke more than anything that could be said. I felt his gaze penetrating me, making me feel that behind that silence was something much more important that I needed to understand. My son noticed this moment too. He didn't pull away, but I saw his body tense slightly, as if he too knew that there was coming a moment when everything had to become clear. Everything in the room, all those silent looks and touches were leading up to one thing, the moment that would change everything. Every move they made was like a piece of this unknown puzzle I was trying to put together. I couldn't stand by any longer. I felt a world of emotions and relationships unfolding before me that had been hidden from me, but now demanded my attention. And so I realized that I could no longer remain a bystander. The silence that reigned in the room was so thick that it felt like a physical presence. The minutes dragged on endlessly, but I couldn't tear myself away from the moment. With every breath, with every glance, I felt the walls around me grow thinner and thinner, and I sank into some unknown world that was increasingly out of touch with reality. I didn't know how much time had passed when my husband finally broke the silence. His voice was low and cautious, but there was an elusive power in it that took my breath away. His words sounded unexpected and naked, like a revelation that shouldn't have been spoken. "You have to realize that this isn't just an accident," he said, his voice shaky, but there was so much confidence in it that I couldn't avoid that look. It always had been, from the beginning. I felt the air in the room immediately grow colder, as if I'd overheard something that had no right to be said. I tried to find answers, but my husband's words made everything around me change, as if he'd opened a new reality in front of me. The son sat silent, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the floor, but I felt his presence become even more palpable, as if he was now part of this game, part of what it all meant. He didn't take his eyes off his father, and I noticed his lips tighten slightly when he spoke again. "I always knew." His voice was quiet, but there was so much emotion in it that I felt something inside me shake. But I couldn't fully realize it. Now, it was clear. My heart raced. I tried to understand what was happening, but everything I heard was foreign, invisible, hidden. These words, these revelations, I couldn't believe they were real. The world seemed to collapse around me, and I stood in the center of the shattered reality, trying to understand what had just happened. My husband, seeing me flinch, came toward me. His steps were slow, deliberate, and when he was beside me, his gaze was full of something I couldn't recognize. I saw his eyes squint a little, and he said something I never would have expected. "I didn't expect you to understand so quickly," he said, and I felt his words penetrate my soul, leaving a trail. "But you have to know that whatever's happening can't be stopped." My body tensed again. I couldn't stand by anymore, couldn't just be a bystander anymore. I could feel this cold fear growing, my thoughts confused, and I couldn't find the right words to ask what was really bothering me. I realized that there was a hidden truth in front of me, hidden feelings that could no longer remain a secret. My husband and son looked at each other, and there was something in their gazes that was hard for me to understand. But I knew that in that moment, everything would change. I couldn't stay in this stalemate any longer. I couldn't just watch these two men reveal their secrets. As if reading my thoughts, my husband leaned closer, and his words became direct, as unexpected as everything that was happening around him. "You want to understand, don't you? You want to know what's behind it all." His voice was almost a whisper, but there was such power in it that I couldn't look away. "And you have to understand, because we're all in this, and nothing can ever be the same." I stood there as if frozen, not knowing what to say. All I could do was listen and try to collect my thoughts. Answers I couldn't find before began to fill in the blanks. But there was something in those answers that I wasn't ready to accept, something that shook me. I stood in the center of this tense world, full of hidden meanings and secrets that began to fall apart, making me question what I knew about my life, my loved ones, myself. Everything happening around me in this moment seemed somehow absurd, like a fantasy I couldn't accept. I could neither believe nor realize that I had been so far away from what was really hiding for so long. My feelings, which had been calm until then, now exploded inside me like a storm, sweeping away everything in its path. I felt a mixture of shame, confusion, and a growing desire to understand what was going on behind the closed doors of this room. I couldn't help but wonder, how long had this been going on? Why had I been ignoring what should have been so obvious? But even stronger was the desire to understand what was behind those looks, touches, inexpressible words. These moments, filled with unspoken emotions, felt like they were burning me from the inside out. I could feel my own boundaries beginning to crumble, my inability to fully comprehend what was happening destroying the world I had built for myself. My confidence was fading, leaving me with the bitter feeling that everything around me was an illusion. I tried to hold on. I tried to regain control, but with every new look, with every word, I was losing myself more and more. These emotions were too strong, too sudden for me to just ignore them. It wasn't just curiosity or a desire to understand. It was something more, something that was pulling me into this world, despite all my fears and misgivings. When I looked at their faces, I could see that they were consumed not only by my presence, but by something else. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but it was clear that their feelings were overwhelming them, and they couldn't hide it. Husband and son. No matter what I thought about what was happening, I couldn't help but notice how their gaze changed, how their touch became more and more confident and meaningful. I couldn't look away because I couldn't stop thinking about what was behind each gesture. I felt their emotions pass over me, as if I were part of this intricate dance, an invisible figure in this world. No matter how I tried to avoid it, I was already caught up in their game, in this invisible but so real world that I was only beginning to realize. Somewhere between passion and fear, I had to accept this new world. I had to realize that everything I knew about intimacy, about trust, about love, were only small parts of what I saw in front of me. I couldn't say for sure what was in store for me next, but one thing was clear. My internal boundaries, what I considered normal, no longer existed. I was on the threshold of something new, something that would define who I would become in the future. It was a test of my own beliefs and fears, and I finally realized that I couldn't just give up. Everything around me became shaky, blurry. I felt every look, every gesture engulfing me, as if I were disappearing into the world. Even though I couldn't understand everything that was happening, I knew I couldn't be the same anymore. As I stood before them, everything I had once known about my family seemed shaky, like sand crumpling under my fingernails. What I was experiencing in that moment could not be described in words. It was as if the world around me had turned upside down. Everything I thought about normalcy, about trust, about close relationships, vanished into thin air, leaving only emptiness and fear of what I had just learned. I began to realize that everything that was happening was much more complicated than I had ever imagined. Normal family relationships as I knew them no longer existed. In their place was this new reality, filled with hidden feelings and secrets that I could only partially understand. And no matter how hard I tried to put things back the way they were, I knew it wouldn't work. The story of my family, which I thought was complete, was now becoming a part of me. When I looked at their faces, I saw more than just anxiety or shame. I saw the realization that we were all now on the threshold of something new. Perhaps it could not be called a change, but rather an awakening. It was the moment when I realized that my perception of what was happening between us had changed forever. My husband and son didn't speak, but their silence was a full admission that their relationship was not what I had imagined it to be. And I, unable to back out, realized that this secret was too heavy for me to continue to ignore. In his eyes, I saw guilt as well as relief. They may not have wanted me to know the truth, but now that it had happened, I could sense that they were relieved. But in that relief, there was fear, insecurity, as if they knew that everything had already changed. My world, my life, everything I thought was stable had collapsed under the weight of the inevitable truth. I couldn't help but feel that this moment was a turning point, not only in my life, but in the lives of my loved ones as well. What seemed impossible was now a reality. I stood in front of them, not knowing what to say. There were no answers. All I could do was stand there and relive the moment. Everything I thought about my family seemed so distant and unreal that I couldn't understand how it could have all been happening for so long, hidden from my eyes. I didn't know what to do with this knowledge, how to act, how to continue living if there was no going back. Instead of words, I felt silence fill the space. It wasn't just silence, it was silence, full of the realization that everything in our house would change now. The secret that had been hidden for so long was no longer hidden, and as much as I tried to figure out what would happen next, I knew that everything that had seemed possible and normal no longer existed. And so, that moment became something that would define our future. We were all part of this new reality, and it was much more frightening than I could have imagined.